To publish our processing projects out of processing and get them running on a web page and not requiring the Java plugin, we really have two solutions available to us. One is processing.js, which means we really don't have to change one line of our code, and it will work, except if we want to do additional things like play sounds, then it gets a little bit messy, because then we have to actually write lines of JavaScript and HTML into our documents and mash them into our processing code. So we create this kind of amalgamation of JavaScript and processing and HTML, and it's odd. It kind of works. If you're not doing sound, if you're just doing images and standard processing, processing.js can be a really good way of working with it. And if under reference, you can, you'll see it looks just like, pretty much looks just like processing's reference. The blue up here is a little lighter blue. If we want to learn, we can find the basic syntax, which is the same. The key thing that you're doing is you have an HTML file, you have your processing.js file, then you will have your project file, your file.pde, and then you will be using those to make your project happen. Or you can even just put the code directly in a JavaScript script tag and it will work as well. It works, and we could use it, and it's okay for certain situations. But right now, I think p5js has a little bit more promise. Disadvantage of p5js is there is no kind of basic code environment like processing has yet. They have one in beta, but they don't have one that is ready to go as of this moment. Now with this, we have a reference library, so we can go look at the reference library and see that it's the same kind of thing. What's really nice about p5js is it's written so that you can do your same kind of processing code. You can also control media elements, sound, webcams, microphones, and things like that. And it can interact with and manipulate or control HTML elements on your page. So it can do all kinds of different things, and it makes it fairly robust as a way of building some rich experiences onto a page. But right now we're just going to port the platform game over to p5js format. Now, if we want to understand how to get going, we could read through the getting started instructions, and we'll see that, well, we're going to need the p5js script. We can either download it, which we will be doing. We could also link to the online version, so our project can just be grabbing the online version. And then after that, we'll find that within our JavaScript, what we just need to do is we have a setup and a draw, same as we had in processing. The key distinction, noticing there is no void anymore. We don't have any of those return types that we specify as part of a function. We just use the word function. So we're going to be able to clean up our code pretty quickly and just say function, function, function. All of our variables, which were ints and floats and strings and other nonsense, all just become var. We just use var. So in some ways it makes the code even easier to work with. Now, there'll be a few differences in lines of code that we will do a little bit different, and we'll learn about those as we get to them. But the instructions here are fairly straightforward on how to go. Now, if you read the processing transition tutorial, it talks a little bit about, okay, well, what is different and what are things you may need to know to convert your sketch over. So it talks a little bit about what you need to do to convert it over if you're so inclined. So you can go and find those instructions and work with it. But I think the easiest way is we're just going to download the complete version. We're going to then add some files to it, and we're going to work with those. So on the download link, we'll download the p5js complete. So I am now going to save mine in my programming folder. I'm going to download this zip file. It's pretty tiny. Downloads almost instantaneously. And we can see I now have a folder. p5-release. We have add-ons. We can control our document object model, or a DOM. We can control sound. And then we have p5js, and then we have the minimized version. A minimized version of code, when we look at that, the way that it's different is a minimized version looks like this. The maximized version looks like this. The maximized version, or the non-minimized, is designed to be human readable. If I look at the minimized version, all spaces have been removed where possible. So we can see that now that entire library has been condensed down into a virtually unreadable chunk of code. But by removing all the comments and extra spaces, what it does is it makes a smaller file. So that file is able to be downloaded faster. And that's the reason for that. I mean, it's not a huge difference. We can see 826K to 246K. But if you're on a crappy internet connection, say on mobile out in the middle of podunk somewhere, it's kind of nice to have smaller downloads, because then you get better service. Because when your phone goes from 3G to 1X and you're like, oh crap, I'm screwed now, it still may work. If we're always on our LTE networks, you don't even notice fat downloads, but it does impact things over time. So and then we have our empty example where we have an index file. There's sketch, there's the library, and we'll be putting some content into our folder to work with that momentarily. So I've now added my movejump in class folder to where I'm working. So it's close to all of my P5 files. Currently, all these files have a .pde name attached to them. I don't want a .pde name. I want all of these files now to be renamed with a .js extension, because we're going to transform each of these files into a JavaScript file instead of a processing file. So go ahead and rename your files now. And when it prompts you and says, are you sure you want to do that? You say, yeah, I know what I'm doing. It's all good. Don't freak out. So that's the first step, is we name our files with the JS's. We have our data folder, which will have the sound in it, because if we're going to have our platform game, we want to be able to jump and have sound, because it just makes it cooler. This also means you could use music and things like that. And if you read through the documentation on the p5js reference, you'll see under the sound library, there's all kinds of things you can do with your sound. So you can put in background music, you can control volume, you can looping, whole 9 yards. It'll be awesome. So we've renamed all of those files. Now if I go back to the empty example, there's two things that I need. I don't need sketch.js. I could bring it over if I wanted to, just because then I could have it as a reference file, because I may want to look at sketch.js and go, oh, I need something here. And the only thing we actually are going to want to, the takeaway from this, is where it says create canvas. We'll notice it no longer says size, it says create canvas, but we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So from the empty example, we want to grab the index file in the libraries folder and add those two elements to movejump in class. So movejump in class should now have a data folder, enemy, index, libraries, the main move file, platform, and sprite. So all of those should be present. And then at this point, we are ready to get dirty and start working. To start converting our files from processing into JavaScript so that they will work properly with p5js, we need to make a few changes. As I mentioned before, we do not do things quite the same. We don't have return types, so anywhere we see the word void or boolean or all of that as the start of a return type for a function, we will be modifying that, which will be, I think, pleasant for you at that point. So that will make it a much nicer way of working. Now, one thing about JavaScript up until this past summer, it did not support classes as part of its language. There was no class designation. They added it into the newest version of ECMAScript, of which then JavaScript is the implementation of that runs in the browsers. So that's ECMA script, ECMAScript. And they added classes, has the community a little bit torn on whether to embrace them and say, ooh, look, we have classes, we're a real language now, or not. But p5js does not use them or require them. JavaScript creates objects. Processing in Java create objects. In Java, we create an object by making an instance of a class. In processing in Java, we make an object as an instance of a class. In JavaScript, our functions themselves are the objects. So we declare a function, and that function can then be the object, and we can make instances of it. And this is the one thing that sometimes gets a little murky for people, is we think of function as actions, where classes or objects are the nouns or the things, and then functions are the verbs, they're the actions. But in JavaScript, a function can be a noun or a verb. It can be an object or an action. So sometimes that gets a little bit kind of, wait, you're using the same thing but differently. And it's like, yeah, we are. That's how the language is. And we roll with it. But when we see how we write the function here, I think it becomes a little bit more apparent. So we're going to take our opening word, this whole opening chunk right here, and it goes away. Gone. Then I will write in the word function. And I'll say, ooh, look, we're getting some pretty color coding now. Because Sublime understands what we're doing when we're working with JavaScript. Now, what we need to do is this next curly brace, which was part of the platform constructor function that we had before, or method, it goes away. I'm just going to comment mine out just so we can see that's the thing that I commented out versus deleting right now. I would encourage you to delete it so it's a little bit cleaner. This word void is going to go away, and we will replace it with the word this dot display equals function. So what we're doing here is I'm going to change my indent a little bit here to make it a little bit more apparent of what's going on. Actually, let's prettify it. There we go. So if we look at this, our platform function is going to have a bunch of variables, and then it's going to have display as a function within this platform object. So it's kind of the same structure. It's just written a little bit different. I like the class space better simply because I think it separates things into more discrete elements, so it's easier to go, this is this is that, and you know clearly. Here you have to pay attention a little bit more. But when we look at this, it's still, if we follow curly braces, it's not so bad. Our main object function, we just say function and we give it a name. But then when we have methods or actions with that object can do, we say this object's display method is a function, and then we have what that content is. Now, we're also going to have to take all of these variables. Notice we got rid of all of those previous lines where we defined the variables. We have to say that this x, y, w, h belong to this object. And we do that by saying this x is equal to start x, this y. So I recommend you actually put this dot, copy it to the clipboard, and then you can just start pasting it in, because everywhere you reference it, you will need it. So this almost abuse of the word this, and it will, by the time we finish going through the sprite and going through the enemy, it's probably going to feel like we're abusing the word this, because you will be using it a lot. But once you get used to it, it's not so bad. Like, oh, okay. No, it's not the end of the world. We can roll with it. Now, if I bop over to the sprite, we'll see, okay, in the sprite, okay, I'm going to get rid of a bunch of stuff. And then get rid of that curly brace that was after that. And then I have to go through all of my voids, change those to this dot, and then the name of that function equals function. So this dot land is equal to function. And then we need to do that for update. We'll have to do that for display as well. And then after you sanitize your function names, then you have to sanitize your variables by adding the this dot in front of all of the variables that are part of this object. Now, when I look at this code, there are some variables that are not part of this object. They're part of my global set of values. So the variables defined up here will all need this dot the rest of the way down. Left, right, up, down will not. And if we see height, height belongs to our main project. It doesn't belong to the sprite. And let's see, oh, and we're not doing width on here, so it doesn't matter. But if we were checking for the width, then it would matter as well, because width belongs to the main sketch, not to the sprite itself. So now I just need to go through and do my this dot paste on everything. And this is the part that gets a little bit tedious in the conversion process. It also gets a little bit tedious when you're writing. Now, if I look at line 16 that I'm on right now, it says this dot y equals destination y minus h. It's really easy. We put the this dot in front of the y and forget this h. And I can say it's really easy because when I first did my conversion and hit run, I forgot the this dot on that h there. And then there was another instance that was just like that on the enemy. I forgot it there. You know, it's really easy to miss those little h's and b's and w's and x's and y's, to miss some here or there. And that's not, it's not end of the world, because JavaScript will tell you exactly which line of code it hates. And then you just go and find that line of code and go, why is that wrong? And once you identify why it's wrong, you fix it. Now, if you are on a laptop and doing this on a trackpad versus with a mouse and keyboard, I will say that it's not quite as fun. But none of it is, end of the world. Ooh, and I almost missed on my G right here, because G is being defined in the sprite. Therefore, it needs this dot. Otherwise, it would have failed. So now I've finished the platform. I've finished the sprite. We're going to move on and do the enemy. And then after we have these three classes done and converted, then we will go into our main document and start converting that. Realize I forgot one thing on the sprite. When we're talking about where it's landing, when we're passing in values, we don't have to now type the values that are being passed in. So we had float and what was being passed in. We just leave it. And the platforms will have the same thing where I get rid of the word float. We just have start X and start Y. I forgot. We don't type any of our values. All we do is define them as variables if they exist outside of a function or a method. We use the word var. Otherwise, we're just saying this because we want to say they belong to that. So on the enemy, get rid of sprite, and then I'll just continue working my way down. We can see float is being defined. No, we don't need float. We change that to the word var. Because again, we don't define things that way anymore. So it's a whole bunch of thises. But if you miss a this, it's totally not the end of the world. Because the console log will tell you that you missed it, and it will tell you what line you missed it on, and then you will fix that, and then you'll go through and run it until you find the next line that you missed. And you just keep repeating that process until your file is done and running. Working on movejump now that we've cleaned up the other three files, this one is going to be handled a little bit differently. The same thing where we don't define types. So instead of saying sprite s, it's var s. Instead of enemy e, it'd be var e. Now, platforms, we can just say var platforms. Left, right, up, and down, var. And then our variables are ready to go. Now setup is a function. And draw, a little bit lower, will be a function. We'll go in and clean both of these in just a moment. But that's our first part. So again, we're not returning types. We're just setting everything, just saying, no, you're a function. You're good. p5js doesn't use size. What instead it uses is a different command. Create canvas. So what happens is when this line of code runs, it hits it and it creates a canvas. A canvas is simply an area that shows up inside your web browser window where we can now write to the content of the pixels. So we will be able to put whatever we want on those pixels. That's the cool part about it. So the canvas in JavaScript is super awesome. And the neat part about canvases in JavaScript is you can actually code as many canvases as you want onto a single screen. So we're not limited to having just one canvas. We can have as many as we want. We can even overlay canvases. So a popular JavaScript game programming technique is you create one canvas for your world and you have a second canvas for the sprites that are moving around within the world, so that when they move around, you don't have to re-render the background that they're on top of. So that saves on kind of processing power that way. So we can separate things out a little bit nicer. It's kind of cool. Okay. So now as we go through this, we can leave background, we can leave smooth. We don't really need them here. I'm just going to comment them out. S is still going to be a new sprite. E is going to be a new enemy. So when we say new, we're saying I want a new instance or create an object of that function sprite or that function enemy. Now, our platforms, we just say platforms is equal to, and the cool part is JavaScript doesn't care how many platforms there will or won't be. Processing, when you create an array, it wants to know how many objects are in that array. Period. And it gets really grumpy about that. JavaScript, it's kind of loose. It's more like, it's the surfer kid hanging out on the beach, just chilling. You can put as many as you want in here. We're all good. We're all friends here. It's fine. So we just say platforms is equal to, and you do the square brackets. The square brackets tells JavaScript, hey, this is going to be an array. And then we can populate the array with the same lines of code that we had before. So as we can see right here, it's not hugely different, except that we don't have to type our variables. We just say var, which is kind of nice. It's kind of nice, but on the other hand, when I look at the code, if I see S, E, platforms, left, right, up, and down, then I have to read the code to find out, well, how are they being used? So I have to figure out how are you using that variable, because it's not readily apparent because I don't know what it is to begin with. So that's the disadvantage of untyped variables. The advantage is you just write the word var and call it good. And that makes a lot of people, especially when you're first coding, happy. But if you look at code long enough, you're like, I want to know what that is ahead of time, so then when I'm looking at the code, I know what it's supposed to be doing. Because then I know if it's a number, what kind of number, and how it can then be used, so then if I look at the code, I know whether it's being used incorrectly or correctly. But in the beginning, if I can just use var, boy, that's nice. I don't have to think. I don't even have to know. I can say var. I just want to store a piece of information. I'll call it var. Give it a name. And then we're good. Now as we work through our draw function, that all stays the same. Display our platforms, that stays the same. We go here, that stays the same. So far, we're kind of on a roll. Everything's working. Now, we're going to have to modify things a little bit when we move into our intersect functions, because as we can see, they have types on them. So we have to get rid of that pesky type stuff. So now we'll just change Boolean to the word function. Get rid of sprite, get rid of enemy. And then where we see float, change those floats. Now when you're working in Sublime, a cool trick, if I double click on the first word, now hold down the command key, double click on the next one, double click on the next one, double click on the next one. I now selected all of those instances of the word float, and now I can just type in the word var, and it updated all of them in one shot. Now that we've completed that part of it, we're going to have to wander down and do the same thing to our other intersect. Actually, we don't even need a second intersect anymore because they're both the same thing now that they're not recognizing different types. So previously, where we used two versions of intersect, one for sprite and platform and one for sprite versus enemy, doesn't care anymore. Doesn't matter. Done. Don't even need it. So now we've simplified that. And now our key press and key release functions will need to be updated to our non-type version function, key pressed, and function key released. So we've pretty much cleaned up our code. Now, when we look at this, The individual what were classes took a little more work because we had to use the word this. Our main document, we changed size to create canvas, and then we changed all variable implementations to the word var. It's kind of it. And then how we declare an array is a little bit different, but otherwise it's very much the same, and in some ways it's easier. And it was nice, kind of cleaning that up. With all of this hard work behind us, we're going to modify our index file so it now can find these different files that we're looking for, and it's going to be able to work with them. So if we jump into our index file, in our index file, what we are going to do is, well, we're not loading Sketch anymore. We're going to load our main file, movejump in class.js. So we'll load that first, and then we have our 3 other files to load. So I can just copy and paste that in and change this and go sprite, that's sprite, enemy, and platform. So I load my main file, and then I load sprite, I load enemy, and I load platform. p5js file is being loaded first, then our files are being loaded after that. By default, it's now setting our body. It just gets rid of all padding and margins, and that means then from that point onward you can do your own styling. That's always just a good beginning part to go on your CSS when you're working with it. We don't even need anything in the body if we don't want it. If we wanted to put in some text, we could put in a paragraph or a headline or title on top of our sketch. We could put in a background color if we wanted, so we could see that our sketch is filled with a different color. I'm going to add a background color just so we can see the borders. So I'll just say background color, and I'm just going to go for kind of a gray. So I'll put a background color in of gray. My next step is to save all of my files and then open this up inside my web browser. Now, if you work in Sublime as your preferred development environment, one thing that you can add to it is you can add to it different build systems. So I've added in a processing build system, also an HTML build system. And when I add in a build system, that means I hit Command B and it will save my files and launch them into Chrome, because that's how I configured my build system. The default install of Sublime doesn't have an HTML web browser build system built into it, because it would be hard to default that when everybody's browser potentially is installed in a different location. So it just makes it difficult for them to do that. So if yours is not set up that way, you need to go through and save all of your files, and then go over and then launch your index file and see it come up. And when nothing shows up on screen, that's a really good indication that something is broken. At that point, we need to pull up our developer console. Under the View pull-down menu, we have Developer and we have JavaScript Console, which is Command Option J. If I pull up Command Option J, it's going to come up, and we can see that now it's unhappy at line 35 in my JavaScript. I have no idea what that is, but I'm going to go find where that problem is in mine. So if yours shows up with a empty screen and you don't see the platform game, then that tells you, you go under View, Developer, JavaScript Console, and now it will come up and it will tell you where your line is. In my haste, I forgot to change my I have int I need to change it to var I. So var I. And then once I do that and save it, now if I, no, wrong thing. If I reload my page here, it works. So we can see it's working. I can fall. I can intersect my platforms. I can intersect with the enemy. Everything works. The next thing we'll do is add the sound into it and make the sound file active. The sound in, we have the sound in our data folder, jump3.wave. So the first thing we need to do is we're going to go into our index file and we need to uncomment out the sound library script. So in our index file where we see it's commented out script, blah, blah, blah. Now when you are in Sublime, even though this is HTML, the command / for comment uncomment works the same as it does in processing or in JavaScript. So now command / I uncommented my sound line. So now I have access to my sound library. So we need access to the libraries / p5.sound.js. So we'll be using that. So now that I've uncommented that, now what we are going to do is we're going to add that to our file. Adding this to our file, we're going to add the sound to our main project. And then we will implement the playing of the sound inside the sprite when the sprite jumps. Adding it to our main project to guarantee that the sound is available before code calls for it, where then that could run into a problem. What we need to do is we need to add in an additional function where we are going to preload it. So first we will say var jump sound. Now by defining these variables outside of any of the functions of our documents, that makes them available to every other object or kind of our classes as they were in our project. So I say var jump sound. Then I will create this new function called function, and it's called preload. We use this when we are loading sounds, images, and things like that that we need to make sure they're loaded before the code tries to ask for them. Because if the code asks for an asset that is not loaded yet, it's going to return as undefined, and then you get errors, and then your code breaks. JavaScript has this weird behavior that sometimes when things break, it just keeps going with it broken. Other times, if it breaks, it's now just dead in the water. It's not, I mean, there's logic to it, but it's at a really kind of deep level. Just assume that if you ask for something and it doesn't exist, your code will break and you'll end up with a white screen of nothing. You'll be sad and cry and have to console yourself with your security blanket or security glass of wine or whatever you choose as your way of coping. So now we will define jump sound. And we'll say it is equal to load sound. And now we specify the file we're loading. It's in our data folder. And the file name is jump3.wave. If we want more information about the different methods for working with or controlling or manipulating sounds, it's all contained on the p5js website. So jump sound is equal to load sound, and then it's in my data folder, and it's my wave. Now waves are not universally supported across every web browser. That can be a problem. You could choose MP3, you could choose OGG. So there's a number of different sound files that you can choose, and there are instructions on the p5js website of how to load a collection of sounds in different formats so the web browser can choose the format that it prefers so that the user is able to have a guaranteed audio experience. And that is something that you could think about incorporating if you so choose. So I've added that to my jump class. I loaded the sound library. Now all that remains is to go into my sprite, and I'm going to want to tell this sound object to play. I want it to play when I jump. And when I jump, that's when I press the up key and I'm currently connected. Then that's where we set our speed Y to a negative value, so we start launching through the air. We tell it we're no longer connected. And then I will say jump sound.play. And that will now tell my jump sound to play when the user jumps. Now, if I try and run my project right now, I'm probably going to see a message that looks something like this. And if I look at my console, I'm going to get this hate-filled message about it can't load the file because that file is local and it's unsure if it's going to be safe, and it's freaking out, and my web browser is all scared and upset, and it needs therapy. And it's really a pain in the butt. But what we have to do is we have to set up a local web server, and when we have a local web server running on our computer, we launch the files within that, and then it's going to run. OS X has a Apache web server built into it, but as of 10.8, they pulled out the automatic installation of it. So it's installed on the, or not the installation, the implementation of it. It's installed on your computer, but to get it to run, you actually have to then go and type a bunch of commands in terminal to tell the Apache server to start running. It used to, when they went to OS X, they added the Apache web server in, and it was there every version, and it was great. And suddenly they pulled it out and make you have to go through these extra, really obnoxious steps to get it running. Lame. Our other option we can work with is we can use a local server software called MAMP. So this is that's a Mac version. There are Windows versions that you can use that set up the same kind of environment. XAMPP is one of them, but MAMP is really a lot easier to use. It's in our applications folder under M for MAMP. It's got the little elephant icon. Now when it comes up, by default, it's going to want to launch its hdocs folder as its root starting place. But if you were following along this afternoon, you know we didn't put our files in the hdocs folder. But we can tell MAMP we want to choose a different starting folder. So if I click on Preferences, and now I can click on where it says Document Root, I click the arrow, and now I can go and find where I want my root folder to be. So I'll see here's programming, here's my p5js that I'm working on, here's my movejump in class that I've just been completing. I'm going to set that up as my root folder. So, and now I have all these windows up that are, I can't figure out which one I'm supposed to be choosing. Let me try again. So, yeah, movejump p5 right here. So I selected that folder. So it tells me administer desktop, and there's a few more things in here. In that folder, I'll say, OK, that's what I want. No, wait. That's not the one I want.
The movejump in class.
Click on the arrow, click on the folder icon, and now I can choose the folder I'm looking for, which is not the one I had going earlier on the desktop because I've been working into my folder here. They just happen to have the same name, which made it confusing. So I'm choosing movejump in class as my root folder. So we can see we have desktop, my folder, programming, p5js, p5 release, movejump in class. That's where I'd put it. Hit OK. So I've set that as my root folder, and then I hit Start Servers, and then I wait for the 2 green lights to show up. And then once those 2 green lights show up in the corner, I hit Open Start Page, and it comes up, and it's now opening up the local MAMP folder. I don't want that. I want to go to my root folder, so I'll just hit Delete on there, and we'll see it now loaded my file. So this is now a web server. You can set up MySQL databases, you can do WordPress installs, you can do everything and test them all locally using MAMP on a computer. So it's really a powerful web development tool. And now I don't get that error message, and we get the sound. If you decide to do your project and want to port it over, and this project involves images, you will want to load those images as part of a preload function, just like we did with the sound, so that you have access to them that way. So you would put all of your image loading information inside the preload function. And then you would call your images the same as you do elsewhere. Push and pop matrix have been simplified a little bit. They just become push and pop. But again, these things about some of the differences between processing and p5js are explained in there's the tutorials of how to convert from one to another, and it talks about that there. But even the main tutorial under getting started, when it goes into it and then talks about processing transition tutorial, you can learn more about converting that way. You can look at the examples page to get more information or other things that are really cool. So you can find neat things both with sound, with visuals, math if it doesn't scare you, dealing with transparency, load and display images. But you are recommended to use preload for your images. That guarantees the images will be accessible to the program when it runs. As you can see in this example, it didn't do that, but I would encourage you to use the preload as your way of loading images. Previously, we loaded all of our images in our setup, or when setup called a class, then that class would load its image at that point. But if you just load everything in the preload, then you have access to them whenever you need them. Other than that, have fun.